The tornado came on a Tuesday, which Maggie Keller always said was proof that God had a dark sense of humor, because Tuesdays were supposed to be the dullest days of the week. She had been in the root cellar when it hit, pressed against the cold earthen wall with her knees drawn up to her chest, listening to the sky tear itself apart above her. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard, not the crack of thunder, not the howl of a winter storm, but something deeper, something that vibrated in the bones and behind the eyes. It sounded like the earth itself was screaming. She counted her heartbeats in the dark, her lips moving soundlessly, her fingers wrapped around the small silver cross her mother had given her on the day of her confirmation back in Indiana, a lifetime ago. When the roaring stopped, she pushed open the cellar door and climbed out into a world that looked as though God had picked it up in both hands and shaken it like a child shakes a snow globe. The year was 1882, and Maggie Keller was 26 years old, a widow of 14 months, and the sole owner of 40 acres of Kansas grassland that she had been working with a determination that most folks in the county found either admirable or deeply worrying, depending on their disposition. Her husband, Carl Keller, had died of a fever the previous spring, a fast, ruthless thing that had taken him in 9 days and left Maggie with a house, a barn, 2 horses, a modest herd of cattle, and a silence so complete it had its own weight. She had not left. That was the thing people talked about most. Every sensible person in the county had told her to go back east, to go to her sister in Ohio, to sell the land and start fresh somewhere civilized. Maggie had listened to all of it politely, had thanked them all sincerely, and had then walked back to her house and kept working. She had learned to mend fences. She had learned to castrate calves, her jaw set and her face expressionless while the ranch hand Hector Vega talked her through it with careful, respectful Spanish mixed with English. She had learned to read the clouds the way Carl had read them, with one eye always on the horizon. She had not learned, apparently, to read them well enough, because here she was now, standing in the wreckage of everything she had built. The house was gone, not damaged, gone. 3 walls stood in a ragged approximation of shelter, the 4th having departed to parts unknown. The roof had been peeled back like the lid of a tin can. The front porch, where she had sat every evening of her marriage drinking coffee and watching the light die over the grass, was a scatter of boards across the yard, some of them driven into the earth like fence posts. The barn had lost its east wall and most of its roof, though miraculously the horses. She had 4 now, including the 2 she had kept from Carl's time, and 2 she had bought herself last fall had not been inside. They were standing a quarter-mile away in the pasture, trembling and pressed together in a tight knot of horseflesh, but alive. Hector was gone. He had ridden to Caldwell 2 days before to collect supplies, and Maggie did not know when he would return. She stood in the wreckage of her yard and looked at all of it for a long, quiet moment, and then she rolled up her sleeves and started picking up boards. She did not cry. She had learned something about crying in the months since Carl's death, that it was a thing with a proper time and a proper place, and that the proper time was not when there was work to be done. She had cried plenty in the dark, plenty in the silence, plenty during the long winter nights when the wind came off the open prairie, and she had no one to press her cold feet against. She had given grief its due, but grief was not useful with a hammer in your hand. She worked until her back ached and her palms bled, and then she wrapped her hands in strips torn from an old flour sack and worked some more. Perry Reed first saw her on the 2nd day. He was riding the fence line of the Callaway Ranch, which bordered the Keller property to the north, a task that Jim Callaway paid him a day wage to do along with a dozen other tasks that ranged from moving cattle to repairing equipment to whatever needed doing on a given morning. Perry was good at whatever needed doing. He was 31 years old, tall in the saddle, with dark hair that curled just slightly at the edges where it grew past his collar, and a jaw that seemed to have been cut from the same limestone that jutted through the Kansas soil. He had a quiet way about him that some people mistook for coldness, and a patience that was not really patience at all, but rather a deep, carefully maintained stillness that he had cultivated through years of living close to difficult things. He had grown up poor in Missouri, the son of a man who worked other men's land, and a mother who worked twice as hard as her husband and asked for half the recognition. He had come west at 19 with $40 and a good horse, and had spent the intervening 12 years learning everything he could about cattle and land, and the particular grammar of the open prairie. He did not own his own land yet, but he was saving toward it with the methodical patience of a man who understood that things worth having required time. He had known Carl Keller in the way that neighboring ranch hands know their counterparts: a nod in town, an occasional shared load of fence work on the boundary, a few words at the church socials that Maggie had organized with such cheerful efficiency. He had known Maggie in the same way, as a presence, competent and warm, always seeming to be in motion, always seeming to know exactly where she was going and why. He had heard about Carl's death. He had attended the burial with the rest of the county. He had watched from a respectful distance as Maggie stood at the graveside without falling to pieces, and he had thought in the private, honest part of himself that he rarely consulted, that she was one of the strongest people he had ever seen. He had not permitted himself to think much beyond that, because thinking beyond that felt like trespass on grieving ground. Now, as his horse crested the low rise between the two properties, he saw the ruin of her farm laid out below him in the morning light, and he pulled his horse to a stop without meaning to. From this distance, the destruction looked total, but moving through it, small and methodical and relentless, was Maggie Keller, dragging a section of collapsed roof beam toward a clear spot in the yard. She was moving slowly but without stopping, the kind of movement that spoke not of strength but of pure, iron-willed refusal to quit. Perry sat his horse on the rise for a long moment, watching her. Something happened in his chest that he did not quite know how to name. It was not pity. Pity was soft and passive, and what he felt was neither. It was not admiration exactly, though admiration was part of it. It was something more like recognition, the way you recognize a piece of music you have never heard before but that nonetheless feels deeply familiar, as though you have always known it and only now are remembering. He did not go down the hill that day. He told himself that she had not asked for help, and that a woman like Maggie Keller would have her own reasons for doing things the way she was doing them, and that arriving on her property uninvited and acting as though she needed rescuing would be an insult dressed up as charity. He was not wrong, as it happened, but the truth was also simpler than that. He did not know how to begin, so he watched for a long time until his horse grew restless, and then he rode the rest of the fence line with his mind only partly on the work. He came back the third day and watched again. She had made progress that was difficult to believe for one person working alone. The scattered debris had been sorted into rough piles, usable timber here, kindling-grade salvage there, stone and rubble in a third heap. She had propped the two standing interior walls with diagonal supports, improvised from fence rails, that actually looked structurally sound. She was working on the roof of the barn now, climbing a ladder she had constructed from nothing apparent, hauling boards up by rope, nailing them into place with strokes that were measured and sure. Perry discovered, watching her, that his throat was tight. The fourth day, he found Hector Vega had returned. He could see the two of them working together in the distance, and the sight of it released something in his chest that he had not realized was coiled there. Hector was good people, Perry knew that much. She was not entirely alone anymore. But Hector left again on the fifth day, as Perry discovered when he rode up to the rise in the gray early morning. The yard was empty except for Maggie. He learned later from Jim Calloway that Hector's wife had been ill, that he had gone back to his own place to care for her, that he had promised to return as soon as he could but could make no certain promise about when. The fifth day Perry watched her wrestle a roof beam alone, a beam that required two strong men to lift, and he watched her find a way to do it anyway, using a rope and a pulley she had rigged to the remaining corner post, hauling the thing inch by inch into position while her face went the color of chalk with the effort of it. He watched her succeed. He watched her sit down in the dirt afterward and put her face in her hands for 30 seconds, not crying, he thought, just collecting herself, and then stand up and go back to work. On the 5th day, he rode away again. He was not proud of it. On the 6th day, he came back, and this time he rode down the rise a little closer than he had before, close enough to see her clearly without glasses, close enough to see that the skin around her eyes was tight with exhaustion, and that she had cut her forearm on something and wrapped it in cloth the same way she had wrapped her hands. She was laying the floor joists for the section of house she was rebuilding, working with a level and a chalk line, precise and methodical, talking to herself a little in a low murmur that he could not hear. He wanted to go down. He had been wanting to go down for 6 days, and 6 days of wanting had not made it any easier. There was something deeply stubborn in him, a clumsiness around feelings that ran beyond polite concern, that held him on the rise like a man watching a fire through glass and not knowing how to find the door. He was afraid, though he would not have used that word himself. He was afraid that she would see through him, that she would look up from her work and see not a neighbor offering help, but a man who had sat on a hill for 6 days watching her instead of helping, and whose reasons for watching were not entirely simple. He was afraid that she would see all of that and send him away. On the 7th day, he came back before sunrise. He did not think about it as a decision, exactly. He woke in the bunkhouse at the Callaway Ranch, in the gray time before the light, and he lay there for about 4 minutes staring at the ceiling with the sound of other men sleeping around him, and then he got up and got dressed and saddled his horse. He rode to the rise and looked down at her land, quiet in the pre-dawn dark, and he dismounted. He looped the reins around the saddle horn and left the horse to graze. He put his reins down. He walked down the hill and into the yard, and without speaking to anyone or announcing himself in any particular way, he picked up the end of the roof beam she had been trying to maneuver the day before, the one she had been wrestling with, the long one, the one that was obviously going to take her another whole day to get into position by herself, and he lifted it and held it. He heard her before he saw her clearly. The sound of her footsteps on the loose boards of the yard, stopping abruptly. "Who's there?" Her voice was steady. She had a hammer in her hand and was holding it the way a person holds something they intend to use. "Perry Reed," he said, "from the Callaway place. I'm sorry to come unannounced. I should have come sooner." There was a silence. "Perry Reed," she said, as though measuring the name for fit. "Yes, ma'am." Another silence. The light was growing gray and soft, and he could see her better now, dressed in work clothes, an old shirt of Carl's likely, her hair twisted back from her face, her expression careful and unreadable. "You've been watching me," she said. It was not an accusation exactly. It was the statement of someone who does not miss things. He felt the heat rise in his face and was grateful for the gray light. "I have. I'm not proud of that. I should have come down sooner. I told myself you hadn't asked, but the truth is I didn't know how to begin, and I let that be an excuse for too long." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the beam he was holding, and something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, but something loosening. "Can you hold that position for a minute?" she asked. "As long as you need," he said. She went and got the rope, threaded it through the pulley she had rigged, and they worked together in the growing light to get the beam into position. It took 20 minutes. At the end of it, when the beam was seated and she had driven the first nails to hold it, she climbed down the ladder and stood in the yard and looked at him with an expression that he could not entirely read, but that felt like the beginning of something. "There's coffee," she said. "If you want it." He wanted it. They sat on the remnants of her porch, a section that had survived, 3 boards wide, just enough to sit on, and drank coffee from tin cups, and the sun came up over the Kansas prairie and turned everything gold. The grass was still flattened in a great swath from the tornado's path, pressed down in a wide arc that swept around the farm, and in the low morning light it shimmered like the surface of a lake. "I should have come sooner," he said again. He kept coming back to it. "7 days, I'm sorry, Mrs. Keller." "Maggie," she said. "Maggie." "You were trying to respect that I hadn't asked," she said. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked out at the ruined grass. "I understand that. People have been strange about it, some of them too eager to tell me what to do, some of them too cautious to offer anything. You fell on the cautious side." "I did, but you did come." She glanced at him sideways, and there was something in the glance that was quietly direct, the look of a woman who has learned to say things plainly because life is too short for the alternative. "On the 7th day, you put down whatever you were holding and you came." He thought about the reins. He had left his horse on the rise. "I left my horse on the hill," he admitted. "Jim might be wondering where I've gotten to." "Will he fire you?" "No, Jim's a decent man, but I should send word." "There's a boy in town who runs messages," she said. "Tommy Greer's son. He'll ride to the Calloway place for a quarter." Perry nodded. He looked at the farm, at the work that still lay ahead of her, and made a decision that was cleaner and more certain than any decision he had made in recent memory. "I'll send the message," he said, "and then I'll come back and help you finish this." She looked at him. "I can't pay you," she said directly. "I won't pretend I can. Whatever I have is in the land and the cattle, and neither of those is liquid. I'm not asking to be paid." "Then what are you asking?" He thought about that honestly. "To not sit on that hill any more and watch," he said. "That's all. I just want to come down and help." Something in her face settled, like a weight that had been shifting, finally finding its center. "All right," she said. "Then come back and help." He went to town and sent the message to Jim Calloway, who sent back word that Perry was welcome to take the week and that the fence line could wait, because Jim Calloway was indeed a decent man who understood that some things mattered more than fences. Perry bought lumber, paying for it himself, because it needed to be done and he had the money in his pocket, and drove it back to the Keller place in a borrowed wagon before noon. Maggie met him in the yard with her hands on her hips and an expression that was immediately suspicious. "That's store-bought lumber," she said. "It is." "Perry, read." "You need it," he said simply. "The salvage isn't going to be enough for the roof. I can see that from looking. You are going to run short by at least a third." She was silent for a moment, her jaw working. He could see the pride in her, the same stubborn independence that had kept her on this land alone for 14 months, the same thing that made her drag a beam by herself rather than wait for help she had not specifically requested. "I'll pay you back," she said finally. "When you're able," he said. "There's no rush." She looked at the lumber for another moment, and then she said, "All right," and picked up her end of the first board. They worked well together. That was the thing that struck him first, that working alongside her was easy. The way working alongside someone who knows what they're doing is always easy, where you don't have to explain what you want because they can already see it. She was precise and strong and completely without vanity about the work. She did not mind dirt or splinters or the grinding ache of physical labor, and she did not perform competence the way some people did, with a constant anxiety about being seen to be capable. She simply was capable and went about it quietly. He, for his part, knew how to frame a wall, knew how to cut a rafter joint, had rebuilt a barn twice in his years with Calloway, and had helped his father build and rebuild so many things in Missouri that carpentry felt like a language he had learned before he learned English. They divided the work without much discussion, falling into a rhythm that felt natural. And by the time the afternoon light turned amber, they had the new roof frame standing on the rebuilt wall. "That's remarkable," Maggie said, standing back and looking at it with her head tilted to one side and her arms crossed. "Two people go faster than one," he said. She glanced at him. "Yes," she said, "they do." There was a pause in which neither of them said anything, but something passed between them that was not quite words and not quite nothing. "I'll cook," she said, turning toward the outdoor fire pit she had set up while the house was still uninhabitable. "You'll stay for supper." It was not a question, and he did not treat it as one. She cooked salt pork and beans over the open fire, and she made cornbread in a Dutch oven that she handled with the ease of someone who has been cooking outdoors all her life. They ate sitting on the repaired section of porch, and the evening came down around them slow and warm, and the fireflies began to blink in the long grass at the edge of the yard. "How long have you been with Calloway?" she asked. "6 years," he said. "Before that, different ranches, moved around a good deal after I left Missouri." He paused. "I came out here meaning to save enough to buy my own land eventually." "Eventually," she repeated with a slight emphasis on the word that was not unkind. "How much of eventually have you gotten through?" He almost smiled. "More than I expected. Jim pays fair." He looked out at the darkening grass. "I'm not in a hurry. I'd rather do it right." She was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. "Carl and I meant to do a lot of things right," she said. It was not bitter. It was just honest, the way she was honest about everything. "We had plans for this place, more cattle, an orchard. I know it sounds foolish in Kansas, but Carl said if you picked the right varieties and watered them properly, it was possible." "It is possible," Perry said. "I've seen it done." She looked at him. "Really? Over near Pratt, a family named Dunleavy. They've got 12 apple trees and they produce every other year." She looked back at the yard, and he saw something kindle in her expression, not grief this time, but something forward-facing, something that had been waiting for permission to exist. "I might still try it," she said. "In the spring." "I think you should," he said. She looked at him again, more carefully this time, in the way she had of looking at things when she was deciding something. "You're an easy person to talk to," she said. "I wouldn't have expected that." "Expected what?" "That you'd be easy." She gestured slightly. "You seem like a hard person, not hard as in cold, but as in solid. Like there's a lot behind the surface that doesn't come out easily." He was startled by the accuracy of that. "Most people don't notice that much," he said. "I notice most things," she said. She stood and collected their plates with the brisk efficiency that was characteristic of her. "It's a habit I got from being the only one in charge of a place. When there's no one else to see things, you learn to see them yourself." He helped her wash the plates at the pump, and then he went to retrieve his horse from the rise. The animal had made its own way down the hill at some point in the afternoon and was grazing contentedly in the pasture, and he said good night. She stood in the yard with her arms crossed and watched him mount up. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked. "Same time tomorrow," he said. He rode back to the Calloway ranch in the dark with the smell of wood smoke and her cornbread still in his senses, and something in him that had been very quiet for a very long time was beginning, carefully, to wake up. The days that followed were a rhythm they made together, so naturally that it stopped feeling constructed and started feeling like the shape of something that had always existed, waiting to be found. Perry arrived each morning before full light and left each evening after supper. He worked with the kind of whole-body commitment that Maggie had only ever seen in people who were not doing a job but building something they cared about, and she was not sure what to make of it at first, except to accept it and be grateful and keep her own feelings in a carefully labeled box on a shelf in her chest. The house came back first. They rebuilt the missing wall and repaired the roof over 4 days of hard going, working around 2 rainstorms that threatened and then retreated, both of them watching the sky with the particular wariness of people who have recently lost something to weather. They were careful with the joists, careful with the rafters, careful with the flashing around the chimney, more careful, perhaps, than strictly necessary, but neither of them said that because they both understood why. On the day they finished the roof and put the last shingle in place, Maggie climbed down the ladder and stood back and looked at it, and the expression on her face was something Perry filed away in a part of himself where he kept the things he did not want to forget. It was not triumph, exactly. It was more like recognition, a house seeing itself in the mirror and knowing itself again. "It's better than it was," she said. "What do you mean?" The old roof had a soft spot over the pantry. Carl kept saying he'd fix it. She shook her head slightly, not with sadness but with the rueful affection that the living sometimes feel for the specific human flaws of the dead. He had 100 plans and not always enough time for all of them. The new roof is sound all the way across. Perry looked at the roof. "It'll hold," he said. "I know it will," she said. And then unexpectedly she laughed, a real laugh, full and sudden, that startled him and startled her too from the look of it. "I'm sorry," she said, putting her hand over her mouth. "I don't know what that was." "It's relief," he said. "It's allowed." She lowered her hand and looked at him with something in her eyes that was open and direct and almost alarming in its honesty. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose it is." They moved to the barn next. The east wall needed to be completely rebuilt, and two of the stall partitions had collapsed, and the loft floor had developed a concerning sag that needed additional support. Maggie worked alongside him on the wall framing with such competence that he stopped offering guidance and simply matched her pace, and they got the frame up in a single day. Hector Vega returned on the 11th day after the tornado. His wife was better, though not fully recovered, and he had come back because Maggie Keller had a farm to rebuild, and he was not the kind of man who abandoned a commitment. He was a compact, brown-skinned man in his mid-40s, with a face like weathered oak and eyes that took in things very clearly and made no speeches about what they saw. He looked at Perry Reed working alongside Maggie on the barn wall and then looked away and said nothing about it, which was the most sophisticated thing anyone could have done. Perry liked him immediately. The three of them worked together for the next week with a comfortable efficiency, and the farm came back piece by piece. The barn wall, the stall partitions, the loft, the fence line nearest the house that the tornado had flattened, the root cellar door that had been torn off and found 3 fields away. Maggie was everywhere at once, organizing, deciding, moving with a kind of perpetual forward momentum that Perry found increasingly hard not to follow simply for the pleasure of watching her think. He caught himself doing it, standing with a hammer in his hand, watching her talk through a problem with Hector, the way she used her hands when she was explaining something, the way she would pause mid-sentence and look at the thing she was describing as though she could see the solution in the air in front of her. He caught himself doing it and made himself look away and felt the blood in his face, which was ridiculous. He was 31 years old. He had been in the company of women before. He had felt things before, though not often and not like this. Not like this. He was not sure how to define what like this meant, except that it was not only that she was beautiful, she was, though it was not the polished, ornamental kind of beauty that drew easy attention. It was the kind that accumulated in small details and hit you all at once when you weren't braced for it. It was not only that she was strong or capable or intelligent, though she was all of those things. It was something more specific than any of those things. It was that being in her vicinity felt like being in a place he had never been before that nonetheless felt entirely like home, which was terrifying. Which was absolutely terrifying, and he kept it to himself as carefully as he had ever kept anything. He did not know that she was doing the same thing. Maggie Keller was a practical woman who had built her life on the discipline of seeing things clearly and acting on what she saw without flinching. She had applied this discipline to the tornado, to the grief of losing Carl, to the daily reality of running a farm alone. She applied it now to the fact that Perry Reed was standing in her barn every morning when she arrived, that he had memorized the angle at which she held a plank when she was about to nail it, that he handed her things before she asked for them, that he had bought lumber for her roof and spent 2 weeks of his life on her property, and had not once made her feel like a charity case or a burden or a woman who needed managing. She applied the discipline of clear sight to all of that, and what she saw scared her to death. Not because she did not want it. That was the thing. She wanted it very much. She wanted it in a way that felt almost disloyal to Carl's memory, and then she would think about Carl, really think about him, the actual man, with his laugh and his specific way of humming under his breath when he worked, and his absolute conviction that she was fully capable of anything she put her mind to. And she thought that Carl, who had loved her well and honestly, would not want her to be alone forever. Carl had not been that kind of man. Carl had been the kind of man who built things so that they would last past him. The thought did not make it easier exactly, but it made it possible. It was on a Saturday evening, 19 days after the tornado, that things shifted between them. Hector had ridden to town with a list of supplies, and Perry and Maggie were working alone in the barn, finishing the last of the loft repairs. They had been working in companionable quiet for most of the afternoon, the kind of quiet that has graduated from comfortable to genuinely easy. And then Perry, who was cutting a board on the sawhorse set up in the barn's broad center aisle, said abruptly and without apparent premeditation, "I want to tell you something." She looked up from where she was measuring the loft rail. "All right," she said. He set down his saw. He looked at her and then at the floor and then back at her. He was not practiced at this, she could see that clearly, and it made something in her chest squeeze with a tenderness she had been sitting on for 2.5 weeks. "I came down the hill on the 7th day," he said slowly, "because I was afraid. Not afraid to help, afraid of what it meant that I wanted to." He stopped and seemed to decide that the only way through was forward. "I've been watching you since before the tornado, Maggie. Not watching in a wrong way, I don't mean that. I mean I've noticed you. For a long time. And after Carl died, I told myself it wasn't the right time, and I told myself that on the hill every day for 6 days, and then on the 7th day I decided I'd been letting that be an excuse for cowardice." She put down her measuring tape. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "I'm not making any claims. I know you've been through things that I can't pretend to understand, and I know that this farm is your life and your work and your choice, and none of that depends on me. I just wanted to be honest with you because you are honest with me always, and it seemed wrong not to be." She walked down the loft ladder. He watched her come down, and when she reached the barn floor and turned to face him, she was closer than the ordinary working distance they maintained, and she looked up at him with the direct, clear look that was hers entirely. "How long?" she said. "How long have I noticed you?" "Yes." He considered being diplomatic about it and then decided against it. "Since you organized the church harvest social 2 years ago," he said. "You made all the men move the tables 3 times until they were right, and nobody argued with you because it was obvious you were right, and I remember thinking I'd never seen anyone that certain about anything." She blinked. "That is a very specific memory." "You were wearing a blue dress," he said, and then stopped, because that was perhaps more specific than he had intended to be. There was a silence that lasted several seconds and had a particular quality, not uncomfortable but very full. "Perry," she said, "yes. I told myself for 2.5 weeks that I was grateful to you as a neighbor and as a person who came down a hill when someone needed help." She paused. "I'm not sure that's entirely all of it." He was very still. "I think," she said carefully, measuring each word the way she measured lumber, "that I'm not as done as I thought I was. She stopped and began again. "I thought that when Carl died, that part of me was done, the part that wanted, and I was all right with that because I had the work and the land and I thought that would be enough." "Is it?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. "It was," she said, "before you came down the hill." He took a slow breath. He did not reach for her, not yet. She could see him holding himself steady, giving her space to finish her own thought, which was itself the thing that undid her. "I'm not a woman who needs rescuing," she said. "I know that," he said immediately. "You never needed rescuing. The house would have been finished without me. Maybe not as fast, but you'd have gotten there." "I know I would have," she said, and then the corner of her mouth moved just slightly. "But having you here was better." And something in him that had been held very carefully finally let go, and he smiled, a real one, the kind that went all the way through, and she decided in the clear-eyed practical way that was how she decided everything, that she was going to step forward. So she did. She stepped forward and put her hand against his chest, palm flat, feeling his heartbeat through the fabric of his shirt, and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the barn was very quiet around them except for the horses shifting and the distant song of a meadowlark somewhere in the evening grass. "Maggie," he said, low and careful. "Yes," she said. And he bent his head and kissed her very gently, with the same care and deliberateness with which he did everything. As though she was something worth being careful with, as though he had thought about it, and had decided that it deserved his full, considered attention. She had not expected it to feel like relief, but it did. After a moment they stepped apart and she looked at him with the slight dazed expression of someone recalibrating, and he looked at her with something so openly tender that she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She picked up her measuring tape from where she had set it down. "We should finish the loft rail before the light goes," she said. "Yes," he said. He picked up his saw. They worked until the light failed, and there was a difference in the quality of the quiet between them that was entirely new, warm and charged and carefully held, like an egg in cupped hands. Hector returned from town with the supplies, and he looked at the two of them as they worked, and he looked at the loft rail that was very neatly and precisely finished, and he said nothing about any of it, which was, as before, exactly the right thing to do. The following weeks were the most complicated and most quietly joyful of Perry's life, which was saying something, because joy was not a thing he had extensive experience with. He and Maggie moved in a careful orbit around each other that was both restrained and deeply felt. They were both private people, both the kind who believed that the inner life was worth protecting, and neither of them was inclined to rush something that felt important. But there were moments. There were many moments. There was the morning he arrived to find her on the roof again, fixing a shingle that had shifted in the wind, and he called up to her to be careful, and she called back that she had been climbing things since before she could read, and then she slipped on the wet wood and caught herself and looked down at him with wide eyes, and he looked up at her with wide eyes, and then they both exhaled at the same moment, and she climbed down the ladder and he said, "Maggie, for God's sake." And she laughed and he laughed too, shaky with the brief terror of it, and then without quite deciding to, he put his hands on her face and kissed her forehead. She went very still under his hands, and then she put her arms around him and pressed her face against his chest and said something into his shirt that he could not hear. "What?" he said. She tilted her head back. Her eyes were bright. "I said you scared me too, when you nearly dropped that beam last Tuesday and I thought it was going to land on you." He had not known she'd seen that. "I had it," he said. "You barely had it." "I had it," he insisted. She shook her head, but she was smiling, and she stayed where she was, in the loose circle of his arms, for long enough that it stopped being a moment of relief and became something else, something that was simply them standing together in her yard in the morning light. He started leaving later each evening. She started making coffee at dusk deliberately. They talked about everything, it seemed, with the appetite of people who have a great deal of stored conversation and have finally found someone worth spending it on. She told him about Indiana, about growing up the third of 5 children in a household that was always too full and always too loud, and that she had found alternately suffocating and deeply comforting. She told him about meeting Carl at 18 at a church picnic, about following him west at 21, when he decided Kansas was the future, about the first years here when everything had been hard and new and terrifying, and also somehow wonderful. He told her about Missouri, about his father, a good man who was better at caring for things than for people, which had its own kind of loneliness, about the years of moving from ranch to ranch, about the accumulation of skill and money, and the very particular kind of solitude that comes from being good at belonging to other people's places without having one of your own. "Does it bother you?" she asked one evening, sitting on the repaired porch with her coffee, the stars very bright above the Kansas grass. "Not having land. It used to feel like an absence," he said. He was sitting beside her, their shoulders almost touching in the way that had become normal and that they both pretended not to notice. "Now it feels more like pending." She looked at him. "Pending," she said, "like something that's going to happen when the right circumstances arrange themselves." She looked back at the sky. A long pause. "This is good land," she said carefully. 40 acres, more than I can manage alone, honestly. Hector is good, but he has his own place and his own obligations." She was choosing her words with unusual care, which with Maggie meant something was important to her. "Carl and I always said we'd add to the East Quarter eventually." There's a section for sale there that Jim Calloway's been looking at, but I don't think Jim really wants it. He's already got more than he can use." Perry was listening very carefully. "I'm not asking anything," she said, almost word for word what he had said in the barn 3 weeks ago, and something in him recognized the echo. "I'm just thinking out loud." "I think you're thinking very specifically out loud," he said very quietly. She looked at him with the level, direct look. "Maybe," she said. He sat with that for a moment, with the weight and the shape of it, with what it meant and what it asked and what it offered. Then he said, "How long do you think a man should know a woman before he asks her something important?" Her breath caught slightly. "I think," she said, "that the length of time is less important than the certainty of feeling." "Do you have that?" he asked. "Certainty?" A pause. The grass moved in the warm night wind. "I'm getting there," she said honestly. "I'm not quite all the way there yet, but I think I will be." "Then I'll wait," he said, "until you are." She looked at him for a long moment, with those clear, particular eyes, and then she reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch rail, and they sat like that while the night deepened and the coyotes called across the flats. October came to the Kansas prairie and dressed it in brown and gold, and the work on the Keller farm settled into a new rhythm now that the major reconstruction was done, and the maintenance of the working farm occupied the days. Maggie got her cattle moved to the south pasture for the winter grazing, with Perry and Hector's help, a 3-day operation that involved more cursing and improvisation than any of them had expected, because 3 of the cows decided they had strong opinions about the south pasture, and made them known repeatedly. Perry could work cattle, and he worked them well, which was something Maggie watched with uncomplicated appreciation, because there was something very compelling about watching a man do difficult things well. She told him so. She was not a person who withheld observations that seemed to her true and kind. "What?" he said over the back of the third and most recalcitrant cow, who had just reversed direction for the 4th time. "I said you're good at this," she said. He gave her a look that was half exasperated and half delighted. "Now," he said, "you're saying that now while the cow moved." He moved with it, "while she's actively trying to go the wrong direction." "I'm saying it now precisely because it's now," Maggie said calmly. "It's easy to be good at something when it's easy." He got the cow turned, eventually, and looked at her from across the animal's broad back with an expression that she was beginning to know well, the one where he had something he wanted to say and was deciding whether to say it. "What?" she said. "You're remarkable," he said simply, like it was a fact he was reporting, like it was something he felt she should know. She felt the warmth of it in her chest and along her arms, and she looked away at the horizon because otherwise she was going to say something unguarded. "Don't be charming while we're trying to move cattle," she said. "It's distracting." She heard him laugh behind her, a real laugh, and she allowed herself a small smile at the grass. In November, he asked her. He had not planned the particular moment. He had the ring, which he had bought in Caldwell 2 weeks earlier from a jeweler who had it in a glass case behind the counter, a simple gold band with a small garnet, unpretentious and warm-colored. He had been carrying it in his breast pocket for 2 weeks, which was not the most comfortable thing he had ever done with his person. And on a Wednesday afternoon, when the first real cold had come down from the north and turned the sky the color of pewter, he and Maggie were bringing the horses in from the pasture, and she was talking about the orchard. She had drawn a plan for it on paper, the 12 apple trees she intended to plant in the spring, and she was describing it now with the forward-facing brightness he loved in her, her voice animated in a way it only got when she was building something in her mind. She had researched the varieties, had written to an orchard supplier in Wichita, had gotten a letter back confirming that 2 specific types, the Maiden Blush and the Golden Pippin, were known to do well in south-central Kansas if planted with proper windbreaks. "The windbreak," she was saying, leading her horse toward the barn, "needs to be on the north side, which means I'm going to plant a row of Osage orange trees first and give them a year to establish, and then the apples behind them. So it'll be 2 springs before I see any trees at all, really. But by the time they're bearing fruit, Maggie," he said. She stopped walking and looked at him, registering the particular quality of his voice. "What is it?" He stopped. He looked at her in the fading afternoon light with her horse standing patiently beside her and her hair escaping from its pins in the wind, and he took the ring out of his breast pocket. She went very still. "I've thought about how to say this," he said, "and then I decided that thinking too carefully about it was probably just another way of sitting on the hill, so I'm going to say it plainly." He turned the ring in his fingers. "I love you. I've been loving you for a while now, and I've been careful about saying it because I wanted to be sure I was saying it right, and I think I'm just going to say it and let it be what it is." Her expression was very open and very quiet. "I want to build something with you," he said. Not just fix what the tornado took. I want to build something new. This land is yours, and I'd never want you to think I was coming for the land. I'm coming for you. The land is what we'd work together." She took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep. "I love you," she said. He was very still. "I've been getting to certainty," she said, "and I got there about 3 weeks ago, and I was waiting to say it first because I was afraid." She shook her head slightly. "I'm not usually afraid." "I know," he said, "but this is the thing that can hurt the most," she said, "when it goes wrong." "Yes," he said, "but I've decided I'd rather be afraid of something real than safe around nothing." She looked at him steadily. "Perry Reed, yes, I'll marry you," he breathed. Then he stepped forward and put the ring on her finger, and she looked down at it and then back up at him, and he kissed her in the gray November cold with the horses standing patient beside them, and the Kansas wind moved through the dead grass around them like a murmur. "An orchard and a husband in the same season," she said against his cheek. "The orchard comes next spring," he pointed out. "I'm planning ahead," she said. He felt her smile. They were married in December, in the little Methodist church in Caldwell, on a day when the sky was a brilliant and impossible blue against the snow that had fallen the night before. Maggie wore a dress of deep burgundy wool. She would have worn white, but the burgundy was warmer, she said, with a practicality that everyone who knew her found entirely characteristic. And Perry wore his best suit and a clean shave, and looked so thoroughly unlike himself in formal clothes that Hector Vega, who stood up as witness alongside his wife Elena, who had recovered fully from her illness, and had become Maggie's firm friend over the autumn, murmured that he barely recognized the man. Jim Calloway was there with his wife, and a scattering of neighbors, and the minister performed the ceremony with the straightforward warmth of a man who had been marrying Kansans for 20 years, and understood that they did not need a great deal of ceremony, only sincerity. When Perry said the words, he said them looking directly at her, and she said hers the same way, and it was a thing so simple and so completely meant that there was not a dry eye in the church, including Hector's, which he denied afterward. They went back to the farm, their farm, which was a new way of thinking that Perry kept turning over in his mind with a particular pleasure. And Elena Vega and several other women had organized a supper that appeared from nowhere and filled the repaired and restored house with warmth and noise and the smell of food, and they ate and talked and laughed until late into the December evening. After everyone had gone, Maggie stood in the middle of her kitchen, their kitchen, and looked around at it in the firelight. The kitchen that she had rebuilt, that he had helped rebuild, that was the same house and also not the same house. That was both Carl's history and their future simultaneously, and she felt the complexity of that without apology. Perry came and stood beside her. He read her as he had learned to read her, with the attention he gave to all things that mattered. "Is it all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm just letting it settle." He nodded and waited. He was very good at waiting, she thought. It was one of the things she loved about him. Not passive, never passive, but willing to hold space for things that needed time, which was its own kind of love. "It's good," she said finally. "Everything feels settled in the right place." She turned to look at him. "Ours," she said, and let the word sit in the air between them. "Ours," he agreed. He had arranged with Jim Calloway to end his work on the Calloway Ranch at the end of the year, and he had spoken to the owner of the East Quarter section, a man named Briggs, who was moving his family to Colorado, and negotiated a purchase that would extend the Keller farm to 60 acres. a number that Perry had done extensive arithmetic about, and believed they could manage well between the two of them and Hector's occasional help, particularly with the cattle arrangement they had discussed. He told Maggie all of this in December, at the kitchen table, spreading out the papers and walking through the numbers with her, because she had absolutely required to be part of every decision, which he had both expected and respected completely. She had gone through the numbers herself and come back the next morning with 3 suggested amendments to the plan, 2 of which he adopted immediately, and one of which sparked a 45-minute discussion that ended in a compromise that was genuinely better than either original position. He had found that thoroughly exhilarating. He had not told her that, but from the small, satisfied expression she wore at the end of the discussion, he thought she might have known. The winter passed in a way that was entirely new to both of them. Perry, who had spent 12 years sleeping in bunkhouses, discovered the specific pleasure of waking in the same place with the same person, of the dailiness of a shared life, of the mornings when the coffee was already made, because she was always up first, and the evenings when the lamp was already lit, because she kept better hours than him. He discovered that she talked in her sleep sometimes, fragments of sentences that almost but never quite made sense, and that she read whenever she had 15 free minutes, pulling a book from the shelf with the purposeful swiftness of someone who has learned that spare time does not announce itself. He discovered that she had strong opinions about how the kindling should be stacked, and that she was almost always right about the weather 2 days in advance, and that she cried sometimes in the early morning when she thought he was still asleep. For Carl, he knew, for the grief that had its proper time and place, and he let her have it without comment because it was hers, and because it was right that the dead should be mourned properly. She discovered that he was a better cook than he had let on, and that he had been deferring to her in the kitchen out of a misplaced sense of propriety that she dismantled by the simple expedient of leaving him to cook supper one Tuesday, and saying nothing about the result except that it was excellent, which it was. She discovered that he was not naturally sociable, but that once he was comfortable he was funny, quietly, precisely funny, with a timing that was almost invisible until the moment landed. She discovered that he kept a small journal, not regularly but occasionally, in handwriting that was better than you would expect from a man who had done most of his learning in one-room schoolhouses, and that he would not show it to her, and she would not ask to see it, because they both understood that some things were allowed to be private even between people who shared everything else. She discovered that he was happy. Not always, not in some gilded way, but in the bedrock sense, in the sense that a man who has been moving toward something for a very long time and has finally arrived there is happy. She could see it in the small ways he moved through the house and the farm, the way he touched things as though they were real, the way he sometimes stopped in the middle of a task and looked around at the land with an expression of quiet, steady satisfaction that made her chest ache with tenderness. Spring arrived with the dramatic immediacy of Kansas spring, which does not graduate from winter, but simply replaces it between Monday and Thursday. The grass came up green practically overnight, the creeks ran full, and Maggie began the first phase of her orchard plan with a determination that Perry found equal parts admirable and slightly alarming, because she had decided that the Osage orange windbreak required 40 saplings, and she had sourced all of them, and they arrived on a single wagon, and she intended to plant them all in a week. They planted them in 5 days, which required the assistance of Hector and Alina and considerable digging. And when the last one went into the ground, Maggie straightened up and pressed her fists against her lower back and looked at the row of small trees with an expression that was purely content. 2 years, she said, and then the apple trees behind them. 2 years, Perry agreed. He was filthy with honest dirt, which was his favorite kind of dirty, and his back ached in a way that was purely physical and would be gone by morning. I'll put it in the calendar. She glanced at him sideways. You know what else I put in the calendar, she said. He raised an eyebrow. She looked at him steadily, with something very particular in her expression that he had not seen before, something that was half excitement and half the kind of serious that comes before large news. "Maggie," he said. "November," she said. "The doctor says November." He stood in the middle of the newly planted windbreak row and looked at her, and then he crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and took her face in both his dirty hands and kissed her, hard and brief and full of everything that he did not have immediate language for. "November," he said against her forehead. "He thinks a boy," she said, "though he says he's only going on instinct, so make of that what you will." "I make nothing of it," Perry said. "I'll take either one." "I know you will," she said. She was smiling against his chest. The summer was full and long and warm, and the farm prospered in the specific way that a farm prospers when tended by 2 people who understand it. The cattle did well. The hay came in heavy, and Perry broke ground on the East Quarter section and got it fenced and prepared for the additional cattle they planned to bring in the following spring. The physical work of it settled him in a way that he had always needed physical work to settle him. The kind of work that answers directly to effort, that shows you at the end of every day exactly what you have done. He was aware that summer of a community around them that he had been partly invisible to as a ranch hand and was now visible to as a man with land, which made him uncomfortable in ways he occasionally voiced to Maggie and she listened to with characteristic directness. "People respect landowners differently," he said one evening with a slight edge to his voice that was not quite anger but was close to it. "Yes," she said simply, "they do. I'm the same person I was a year ago." "Of course you are. But you are also now a person who owns something, and in this part of the world, owning something is what grants you the kind of respect that should simply be given to a person for being a person." She paused. "That's not right, but it's true." He thought about it. "Hector doesn't get the same treatment," he said. "No," she said quietly. "He doesn't. Even with his own land he doesn't." She looked out the window. "That's a different injustice and a worse one. I've thought about it." She turned back to him. "I've had Hector and Alina to supper more times than I can count, and I will keep doing it, and I'll ask them to the same socials I go to. And when people give me sideways looks about it, I'll look directly back at them until the sideways look goes away. That's not enough. But it's not nothing." Perry looked at her with the specific love that comes from seeing someone know a hard truth clearly and choose to act on it anyway. "No," he said. "It's not nothing." The autumn came and the preparations began. Alina Vega came to help, and a neighboring woman named Sarah Marsh, who had 4 children of her own and a practical expertise in births that she shared with the brisk confidence of long experience. Perry was the kind of man who paid close attention to everything, except that in this particular matter, he was also the kind of man who needed something to do with his hands. And so, he built a cradle in the weeks before November arrived, working on it in the evenings by lamplight in the barn, taking much more time than was strictly necessary, because the care he took on a given piece of woodwork was in direct proportion to how much it mattered to him. Maggie came out one evening to find him sanding the rocker runners by lamplight, his face focused and still. "Come to bed," she said. "Just finishing," he said. "Perry, you've been just finishing for an hour." He looked up. She was standing in the barn door with a lamp of her own, her hands resting on the swell of her belly with the unconscious gesture that had become hers over the last months, and she looked, he thought she looked like something that needed painting, like something that needed to be made permanent, because it was too good to trust entirely to memory. "It needs to be right," he said about the cradle. "I know," she said gently, "but it is right. It's been right for 2 days. Come to bed." He put the sandpaper down and looked at the cradle. She was correct, as she generally was. "Tomorrow I'll put the finish on it," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He came to bed. She was asleep within minutes, as she had been doing lately, sleeping with the profound completeness of a body engaged in serious work. He lay awake a little longer, listening to the night sounds of the farm, the horses in the barn, a distant coyote, the wind through the dry autumn grass, and felt around him the particular quality of a life that had been built carefully from difficult materials, and he was grateful for all of it, including the difficulty. The boy was born on a Thursday in November, as the doctor had broadly predicted, though Thursday was his own addition. He was born loudly and early in the morning after a labor that Maggie managed with the same determined competence she brought to everything, which Perry knew because Alina told him afterward, since he had spent the labor sitting on the porch in the cold with Hector, and a flask of brandy that neither of them drank very much of, but that was helpful to hold. When Alina opened the door and told him to come in, he went in. Maggie was sitting up in the bed, her hair loose and damp, looking as though she had been through a battle, which she had, but also with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something beyond contentment, something that was almost astonished, as though even this woman who had seen and done and endured so much was genuinely surprised by the fact of the thing in her arms. The thing in her arms was very small and very red-faced, and was making periodic sounds of complaint about his recent change of circumstances. Perry sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and the feeling that moved through him was too large for any existing word, so he did not try to name it. "He looks like you," Maggie said. Perry looked at the baby doubtfully. "He looks like a potato," he said. Maggie laughed, exhausted and real. "Perry, a very good potato," he said quickly. "The best potato I've ever seen. That is an awful thing to say about your son." "He'll fill out," Perry said. "By spring he'll be handsome." She shook her head and looked back at the baby, and her expression went back to that particular astonished tenderness. "We need to name him," she said. They had talked about names. They had talked about them extensively without arriving at a firm conclusion, which had been fine because there had been time. "Thomas," Perry said. He had not planned to say it, but it came out curt. "Thomas," she said, trying it. "For anyone specific." "My father's name," he said. "He was a good man, even when things were hard. I'd like to give it somewhere." Maggie looked at him with the open, clear look that was entirely hers. "Thomas," she said again, to the baby this time. "Thomas Reed." She paused. "Thomas Carl Reed," she added, with a slight lift in her voice that was also a question. He met her eyes. Thomas Carl Reed, carrying both of them, all of the history of this land, all of the men who had contributed something to the life this child would be born into. "Yes," he said. "That's right." She leaned against him carefully with the baby between them, and he put his arm around her, and the November morning light came through the window of the house they had rebuilt together, and the farm around them was quiet and present and entirely theirs. The years that followed were the years of building, not in the literal sense, though there was plenty of that too, but in the sense of building a life layered in seasons and small important events that accumulated the way soil accumulates. Slowly, productively, changing the landscape beneath your feet so gradually you don't notice until you look back and see how far you've come from where you started. Thomas Reed grew from a potato into a round-faced, cheerful baby, who became a toddler of considerable opinion, and then a small boy who followed his father around the farm with the specific devotion of a boy who has decided his father is the most interesting person in the world. Perry bore this with a combination of genuine delight and deep seriousness, because he understood that being followed meant being watched, and that being watched meant being the thing that was learned from, and he wanted very much to be worth learning from. He took Thomas on horseback beginning at 3, in front of him in the saddle on short circuits of the property. He taught him the names of grasses. He explained the movement of cattle with the patient specificity of a man who loves a craft and wants to pass it on. He taught him carpentry at 4 by giving him a piece of wood and a small hammer and letting him discover for himself the physics of nails, which Thomas did with great enthusiasm and varying accuracy. Maggie watched all of this with a love that still occasionally surprised her with its completeness. She had loved before, had loved Carl deeply and truly, but this was different in the specific way that the same thing is different at different times of your life. She was different. She had been through more, had built more from wreckage, had learned more about what she was capable of, and she loved now from a place of someone who knows her own ground. She planted her apple trees in the spring of 1885, behind the now-established Osage orange windbreak that had done exactly what it was supposed to do, and stood in a solid row against the north wind. The apple trees went in on a warm April morning, and Thomas, who was 2.5, helped dig 2 of the holes and was immensely proud of this, and Perry drove the wagon and handed down the saplings with the care they required, and Hector and Alina came to help as they always came to help and were helped in return. In 1887, the second baby came. This time it was a girl, and they named her Ruth, and she arrived in the world already quiet and considering, with dark eyes that looked up at you as though she was already thinking about something complicated. Thomas, who was 4, regarded her with deep suspicion for about 3 weeks, and then adopted her with the total commitment of a child who has decided something is his responsibility, and from then on could generally be found nearby, which was sweet and occasionally extremely inconvenient. Perry watched his daughter with the particular look of a man who has discovered a new form of love he did not know existed before and has no adequate framework for it. He held her with the same careful deliberateness with which he did all important things. He sang to her, which Maggie pretended not to hear because it made her cry and she had her dignity to consider, but which she in fact heard every single time and treasured beyond speech. The farm by 1888 was 60 acres, well established and well run, with a cattle operation that had tripled from the original modest herd, a kitchen garden of enormous productivity that Maggie tended with the systematic devotion she gave to all growing things, and an orchard that in 1889 bore its first fruit, 24 apples from 3 of the 12 trees, which Maggie picked with a care that bordered on reverence, and which Perry and Thomas ate with great ceremony at the kitchen table while Maggie watched with a look of satisfaction, so profound it was almost funny. Carl would have loved to see this, she said. She said it freely, the way she had learned to talk about Carl as someone who had been real and mattered and whose absence was part of the landscape of the place, not erased by happiness but held alongside it. Yes, Perry said, he bit into the apple. He was right about the varieties. He was right about the land, she said. She looked out the kitchen window at the rows of trees. He always knew it was better than it looked. So did you, Perry said. She turned and looked at him. There was something in the look that was the whole of them, all the years of it, the tornado, the hill, the 7th day, the beam. All of it accumulated into this kitchen and this October evening and the apple in his hand and the children's voices from the other room. We made it good, she said. We made it very good, he said. She came and sat across from him at the table and took the apple from his hand and bit it, and the juice ran down her chin, and she wiped it with the back of her hand and handed the apple back, and he looked at her and thought, not for the first time and not for the last time, that this was the woman who had been dragging a beam across her ruined yard in the gray morning light when he first saw her whole, and that he had been a fool to sit on that hill for 6 days, and that he was grateful every single day that on the 7th day he had put down his reins and walked down the hill. In the autumn of 1890, Perry rode to Caldwell to file the paperwork that made the land officially titled in both their names, Maggie Reed and Perry Reed, 60 acres, Sumner County, Kansas, a thing that had required some navigating of the law as it stood, because the law as it stood was not always kind to women who held land in their own right. He had hired a lawyer, a precise and careful man named Aldridge, who had found the correct arrangement, and the deed came out right, and Perry brought it home and put it on the kitchen table, and Maggie read it and then looked up at him. It already felt like mine, she said. The whole time. It was yours, he said. It's just that the paper caught up. She folded the deed and put it in the box with the other important papers, and went back to what she was doing, which was writing a letter to the orchard supplier in Wichita about 2 additional apple varieties she wanted to try on the south-facing slope. And Perry watched her write, and felt the ordinary profound pleasure of an evening in a house that is genuinely home. By 1892, They had 4 children: Thomas, who was 9 and serious and extraordinarily good with animals; Ruth, who was 5 and already showing a mathematical precision that astonished both her parents; a third child, a boy named Henry, born in 1890, who came into the world at full volume and maintained that approach to existence with complete consistency; and a fourth, a girl named Clara, born in 1892, who was placid and observant, and who would spend the first year of her life being carried around by Thomas, who considered the carrying of younger siblings to be among his primary responsibilities. The farm fed them all. The orchard grew. The cattle multiplied in the methodical way of things that are well tended. Perry and Hector added a second barn in 1891, smaller than the first, for the expanded herd, and Perry built it with the same care he brought to all structures and the same attention to what the future would need, which Maggie said was the truest expression of his character she could imagine. "You always build for what's coming," she said, "not just for what's here." "That's just sense," he said. "It's more than sense," she said. "Most people build for what is. You build for what will be." He thought about that and decided she was probably right, and that she was probably also describing herself, and he said so. She laughed. "Then we're well matched," she said. "We are," he said, without any qualification at all. In the spring of 1893, the apple orchard was in full bloom for the first time, all 12 trees, the windbreak having done its job across 10 years of Kansas weather, the roots deep now, the branches thick with blossoms that turned the north section of the farm into something that made people pull their horses up on the road and stare. Maggie walked through it on a May morning with Clara on her hip and Ruth beside her, and the petals were falling in the warm light, and it looked nothing like Kansas was supposed to look, and everything like something she had imagined from the beginning. Perry found her there when he came in from the East Quarter, and he stood at the edge of the trees and watched her for a moment before she saw him. She was pointing out the blossoms to Clara, her voice low and warm, and Ruth was running her hand along the bark of the nearest tree with the absorbed attention of a child who finds the world genuinely interesting. He thought of the girl in the blue dress moving tables at the harvest social, certain and purposeful. He thought of the woman in the ruined yard in the gray morning, dragging beams by herself. He thought of the rise above the farm, and the 6 days he had sat there watching, and the 7th day when he had put down his reins and walked down the hill. He thought of everything that had come from that one decision to stop sitting above things and start being inside them. The house rebuilt, the orchard planted, the children running through it, the woman who had made him understand that home was not a place you find but a person you choose. He walked into the orchard. Maggie turned and saw him, and her face opened into the smile that was entirely hers, warm and clear and direct. "Perry," she said. "Good morning," he said. He came and stood beside her and looked up at the blossoms overhead, white and pink against the blue of the Kansas sky, and Clara reached out from Maggie's hip and grabbed a fistful of his shirt, which was her preferred greeting. "Carl was right," he said, "about the varieties." "He was," she said. "He usually was about the land." "So were you," he said. She leaned against him slightly, the way she did the comfortable press of a person who knows they are welcome. "We got here," she said. "We did," he said. "It took a tornado," she said. "And 6 days on a hill," he said. "And the 7th day," she said. "And the 7th day," he agreed. Ruth had found a beetle under one of the trees and was examining it with great seriousness. Clara made a noise of demand against Perry's shoulder. Thomas was somewhere in the East Quarter already, because at 9 he preferred to be useful, and Henry was almost certainly in the barn turning something that should not be turned. The farm was full of the ordinary noise and motion of a life being actively lived, all around them, on land they had rebuilt and grown and made permanent. Maggie looked up at him, in the flowering orchard in the spring light, with her children around her and her land under her feet and all the years of it behind and ahead of them, and she put her hand against his chest the way she had in the barn that first time, feeling his heartbeat through the fabric, and she said, "I'm glad you came down the hill." He put his hand over hers. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The orchard bloomed around them, and the Kansas spring wind moved through the white blossoms, and the petals fell like snow that was warm, and all of it was theirs. The land and the work and the children and the life. The full, complete, deeply particular life that had been built from the rubble of a Tuesday tornado, and a man's decision to stop watching from a distance and put down his reins and begin. Everything that had been broken had been rebuilt better. Everything that had been lost had been, in its own time, returned in new forms. And the farm stood solid in the Kansas light, year after year after year, with its root cellar full and its orchard blooming and its family growing inside its walls, and the deed in the box with both their names on it, and the cradle that sat now in the corner of the room where Ruth slept, worn smooth from use, waiting always for the next child, the next season, the next turning of the land under capable and loving hands. This was the life of Perry Reed and Maggie Keller Reed, built board by board and year by year on the open Kansas prairie, in the years when the frontier was being turned to something permanent by people who had the endurance for permanence. And it was, in every way that mattered, enough. More than enough. It was everything.